Your task this time was to describe a use case of the arrow function and to name at least one limitation of using the arrow function. If you're learning JavaScript, you've probably encountered arrow functions, which use the arrow notation to concisely define a function. They can be very handy, but it is important to know when to use them and when not to use them. Let's take a look at this example here. In this example, we wrote two expressions to log an array of the lengths of our dog names. When the program is ran, they each log out the same answers onto the console. The first expression uses a simple function expression, and the second one uses an arrow function. The syntax of the second expression is shorter and more clear with the implementation of our arrow function. Note that we did not explicitly write return in our arrow function as we did in our function expression up here. If we had left return out of our function expression here and run the program, we would get undefined logged out for each dog length. This is because a function in JavaScript will return undefined unless we tell it to return something. That is, regular function expressions use explicit returns. So what I'm saying here is that the callback function here needs to return something for .map to add it to the new array. Another thing to note is that when there is just one argument, we can write an arrow function with the arguments on the left side of the arrow, either enclosed or not enclosed by parentheses, which is pretty cool. However, if there are multiple arguments, you do have to enclose the arguments with parentheses. So instead of, for example, dog and dog1 here, we have to enclose them with parentheses. The main benefit of using arrow functions, however, is their more intuitive scoping and binding of the this object. Unlike a regular function expression, if we use an arrow function inside another function, the arrow function retains the scope of the method it was declared in. Let's take a look at an example of this. In this example, we have a test object. Inside the test object, we have a name property with test as the value, and we have two functions inside. We have create anon function up here, which is a function expression, and we have create arrow function right here, which is an arrow expression. And down here, we are simply setting these two functions to variables, anon func and arrow func, and invoking them. Let's run the code to see what we get logged out. When we invoke the create anon function, for this.name we get undefined, and for arguments we also get an empty object. This is because in this situation, the function expression is invoked from another function, so the this value here is global. The function expression rebinds the value of this to the global context or the global object. And there is no name property or arguments on the global object. For the arrow function down here, we do not have to bind the context of the function and thus the value of this, because arrow functions retain the scope of the method they were declared in. This means that arrow functions do not rebind the value of this because they do not have their own this. And that is why when we invoke the create arrow function down here, we are able to log out the value of the this.name property, which is in the test object of which this function was declared in. And we also are able to access its arguments. The arguments being 0, hello, and 1, world. 0 representing the first index of our argument, which is hello, and 1 representing the second index of our arguments, which is world. Now let's take a look at some of the limitations that arrow functions have. In this example here, we have fatDog1, which has a property weight in pounds, and a chaseball function, arrow function expression. We also have an object here called fatDog2 with weight in pounds property, but this time we have a chaseball function as well, but it is a function expression. And for each object down here, we are calling each respective chaseball functions before we log out their weight in pounds to see if they actually decrement after we call the chaseball function. Let's run the code and see what we get. So when we invoke the chaseball function on fatDog1, the value stays the same at 9. We did not actually get to decrementing the weight in pounds. Since arrow functions do not rebind the value of the this context, when using an arrow function as an object method, the this will point to the parent scope instead. And in the parent global object, there is no weight in pounds property. Thus, we cannot decrement fatDog1's weight using the this in an arrow function method. In this case, we should use regular function expressions for object methods that utilize the this keyword. For fatDog2, we see that the this is bound to the scope of fatDog2, and so that is why we were able to decrement the weight in pounds value. Let's take a look at one last limitation of arrow functions. It's important to note that because arrow functions do not rebind the this value, they cannot be used as constructors. Using an arrow function as a constructor will result in the error shown here when we log this out. As you can see, we're getting a greeting is not a constructor error. However, if we comment out the arrow function and we uncomment out the function expression version, we will get what we want logged out. Great, we're getting hello world logged out for the this.text value when we create a new greeting down here. Let's take a moment to review the benefits and limitations of using arrow functions. Arrow functions have shorter syntax than function expressions, which can make it more easier to read. Arrow functions also have implicit return statements, meaning you don't have to use the return keyword all the time. This means that you do not have to explicitly write the return keyword every time you return something. And the main benefit is that there is no binding of this. And so this allows arrow functions to retain the scope of the method they were declared in. Now let's look at some of the limitations. Some of the limitations of using arrow functions are that they are not suited for object methods. This is because arrow functions do not rebind the value of this. And so when using arrow function as an object method, the this will point to the parent scope. They also cannot be used as constructors for this reason as well. It is best to use function expressions as constructors. And also, they are harder to debug in general because they are anonymous functions. And so if you ever get an error in your code, you will not be able to trace the name of the function or the exact line number where it occurred. Great. That sums up this lesson. See you in the next video.